Today's Thinking Thursday is going to be a little bit different because today I'm not going to do any edits and I have no notes. So we're just going to go with the flow and see what happens. Today we're going to talk about Rebecca Boone, as well as talking about how the way that you name someone or the way that you talk about someone often defines how you think about them or what you think is important about them. So Rebecca Boone is kind of a perfect example of this, because if you look her up in history, most references to her say that she's just the wife of frontiersman Daniel Boone. And I just want to eviscerate that immediately, because I think she was actually more of a frontiers person than he was, because she was creating stable colony. Yes, he was like pushing the frontier, as in having battles and invading places, but she was the one who's actually creating a homestead that had sustainability, and she was quite literally breeding a colony at the frontiers that she was making. So in the end, I think she's more of a frontiers person than he was. He's just going out with a gun and being like, ah! And she's actually like, no, I'm going to create an unquestionably stable colony and settlement, which I think is more of a frontiers thing to do. You're actually creating a sustainable frontier rather than just going and shouting at people and being aggressive. So what was she doing in her frontiers work, and what was she doing in her sustainable, stable settlement? Well, she had a crop of corn and she had loads of vegetables. She had 10 children to feed, so that was a big kitchen garden. And she was also taking the pelts of furs and she was selling them, so she had a bit of entrepreneurship going as well. And she was also maple sugaring, so she was taking, basically maple sugaring is like 10 times harder than making maple syrup, because maple syrup is a 40-to-1 concentration. So you have to have like 40 gallons of tree whiz to make 1 gallon of maple syrup, whereas maple sugar is 10 times that. It's 10 times more difficult. So especially in that era, you'd have to have like a vast cauldron of huge amounts of tree wet, and then you would have to be stoking the fires basically for days, if not weeks, to concentrate down all of that tree goodness into actual sugar. And this is something that actually she and Daniel did together, I guess, as like a date night or something, or like the way of them connecting, because they had a very disparate relationship. He would be gone for sometimes months or even years at a time. Personally, that would not be the date night that I would choose. If like you'd just been gone for 2 years, I'd be like, let's do something other than like hard labor. But they also definitely got sweaty in other ways, because 10 kids. Side note, those 10 kids were all living in one cabin with no interior walls. So if you think the concept of witnessing your parents screwing is disturbing, those kids would be disturbed. But I think then it was just a lot more like, just pretend that you don't see it. But also then she took in 8 more adopted children from the family due to tuberculosis. And I guess they would also be in the same space. I don't know how that happens. Like, what do you do of like, well, he's been away for 2 years, so I need to catch up on the shagging. You're like my adopted children, and this is even weirder, but like, I don't know what happens in that situation. Like, does a curtain go up? I don't know. Maybe it's not worth thinking about. But anyway, a lot of children were made in the same space. And weirdly, they were made in the same space at the same time that her oldest children, like she was still having children when her oldest children started to have children, and they were still living in the same house. They did move out after that, but ew. Anyway, yeah. So she was also making an entrepreneurship with selling the pelts, as well as selling maple syrup and maple sugar. But she was also defending the settlement that she made. So she would make these forts with these other women in these communities, because the men would just go off. They would go off to frontier, basically tiny war. That's as far as I understand frontiering, is just to create tiny war. And then the women would be left to actually make sustainable settlements. And so they would build these really high walls around their forts, and then the women would dress up as men and walk around the periphery of this really high wall dressed as a man, armed, so that it looked like men were defending them, which I think is silly, because as far as I can find in the research, and I don't really want to support a gender divide. So even a gender divide that like is positive in the direction of the gender identity that I'm most associated with, I don't really want to support gender divides, but it does seem like women are generally better shots than men, both in gun firearms, but also in bow and arrow. So they don't really need men to defend them because they're better off by themselves. And later on in life, like she was doing hunting anyway, but when Daniel Boone got arthritis, she was going out on the hunting trips with him because she was just better. But I think it's very interesting to kind of look into what does it mean to be a colonist, because she was born in 1738 or 1739. I had two different sources for the year of her birth, but they both said she was born on the 9th of January. But she was born into a family in the colony of Virginia, and they moved into wilderness lands that they didn't really belong to with her whole extended family when she was 10. So if you think about a colonist or a frontiers person, like what does that mean? She's 10 years old, just basically going along with her family. Is she a colonist? Like, is she a frontiers person? Like, when does that become relevant? And I also want to look at the geopolitical circumstances that she was under so that we understand her situation, because it wasn't just that she was like ignorant to the geopolitical situation around her. It wasn't just like she was going, oh, there's some trees, we can live amongst those. She was also part of a movement that was aggressively defying the rules of where they could settle. And that was due to a divide that was happening between the people in the colonies and the people running the colonies. So the group that she was from, the Georgia colonists, was a crown colony. And what that means is that sometimes there was like a legislative and an executive council, but sometimes it was just like a governor telling you what to do. But basically, there wasn't really any representation in local government. So even at like the lower houses of local governments, there really wasn't that much representation from the actual local people. It was mostly just governors from the UK bossing around people in a completely different country, from a country that those people have never been to. But most of it was that the governor was reporting back, like a privy council, to the monarch and telling them what was going on, and then the monarch was making decisions. The monarch never needed to go there, didn't know anything about the place, had no really accurate or relevant opinion, was just like, you know, making decisions from afar. So I understand that the people of the colony were like, why should we listen to you? You aren't here, you don't know us, we have no representation in Parliament, because there was zero representation in Parliament from the actual people of the colonies. So I understand their perspective of like, you can't tell us what to do, you don't know us, you don't know our place. But at the same time, she was doing something illegal, and I also think she was doing something that she shouldn't have been doing, not just from a legal perspective. I'll come back to that. But this situation where she's in a crown colony, so she's run by, at the time, King George III, the monarch of the UK, and he is telling them, no, you have to stay in this area. You can't go west of the Appalachian Mountains. That's really important. So basically when North America was being divided up between France and Spain and England and the Native Americans, and basically a load of other countries who weren't Native Americans were deciding that they wanted a chunk of America, that was it put into a treaty called the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And kind of following that, King George III made a proclamation in 1763 that specifically said that the settlers of the colonies could not go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so any colony or any settler that was settled west of the Appalachian must forthwith remove himself. I love that. I literally read the original text and it says forthwith. I missed that word. Bring that back. That word is glorious. But yeah, forthwith remove themselves. And then, so these people were specifically defying. It wasn't just that they were like, we don't know, we haven't read the newspapers. It's that they specifically were like, you can't rule us. We're going to make new fronts, expand the frontier. So I think at some point specifically by the influence of Daniel Boone, sorry, her son was James Boone, Daniel Boone, her husband, who was very much like, I want to defy the monarch of the UK and expand into new territories. She sort of became a frontierswoman through that, and I think she did it more successfully because she created sustainable and stable settlements. He created conflicts and then brought his sons into them, and then some of his sons were killed. I don't think his way of going about it was sustainable or successful. So I think she's more of an effective frontiers person than he was. But I also want to address why I don't think that she should have been doing the frontiering that she was doing anyway, even though I agree with the fact that being ruled by someone who lives in another country, who's never come to where you live, and you've never been to where they live, it doesn't really work. It's not an effective situation in the polis. You aren't going to create sustainable rule by knowing diddly squat about the people that you're ruling and really having no interest in hearing their opinion. So I get that, but I also think that she shouldn't have been in the places that she was going to. And the first place that she and Daniel moved to is kind of a perfect example of this, because the first place that they went to settle when they were teenagers and just freshly married was actually a hunting reserve. So it was a Native American hunting reserve, which was left alone, uninhabited by people for very, very, very good reason. So Daniel sees this place that he calls wilderness, and it looks uninhabited, it looks available, and he's like, let's go live there. And the reason it caused so much conflict is because it was left uninhabited by humans for a very good reason. And then Daniel and Rebecca paid the price for not listening to the Native Americans, because the Native Americans had left this hunting reserve so that, firstly, the animals wouldn't be scared away, which of course, when Daniel and Rebecca moved in and they start having babies, all the animals suddenly don't want to be there anymore because it's noisy and there's gunfire every time they go outside. You know, every time they come close to the house, they're shot at. So of course, all the animals disappear. But also, Rebecca and Daniel just hunted it to emptiness. So they used up all the resources. And the reason that the Native Americans had left it alone and then done the seasonal hunting is so that basically the supermarket could be restocked. If they aren't allowed to breed and they're just, everything is wiped out and killed, then you basically emptied the supermarket and it's never going to be restocked. So you have to be committed to the seasonality of that structure. The Native Americans were operating sustainably and the colonists were just ignorant fools. And this is also the thing that frustrates me, is that when it comes to creating these treaties or these proclamations, at no point in the legislation is there any real respect for the fact that the Native Americans are the most intelligent and most informed about living on that land. So if a colonist wants to move in and wants to settle there, they should incorporate the Native Americans and their knowledge into how they're living in that land. If you just move to somewhere and you have no understanding of the culture, of the nature, of the circumstances, you're probably going to do some damage because you haven't respectfully moved into the place that you want to live. So I really feel disappointed that both like monarchies but other governments weren't putting forward the idea that you have to respect the Native Americans, not just because they happened to be there first, like fair enough, they did happen to be there first, but also they happen to be the most informed about respecting the land, and you will need that to create a sustainable colony. So yeah, I don't think she should have been there in the first place, and unfortunately she and Daniel kind of exhibit this ignorance over and over again. So even as they have this massive family, in the end they have like a small settlement of about 80 people. They keep having to move because they just don't learn. They're just like, kill everything and eat everything. And then there's nothing left. So they don't really nail their existence because they just keep fighting with the people who could inform them about how to live there. So yeah, and then the other thing that... Okay, I have to name it for what it was called, but I'm going to explain why I'm never actually going to call it that. But the place that they pushed into, the place that they shouldn't have been, so pushing west across into the Appalachian Mountains, was called the Indian Reserve. And the reason I cannot stand that name is not because I'm being like offended for someone else's sake or pretending to be woke. It's because imagine if some absolute ignoramus showed up at your doorstep and was like, I've discovered India. You are an Indian. I would go, no, you're an idiot. The fact that that not only made it into history and had any kind of survival as a incredibly stupid term, but then made it into American legislation, made it into law, is the most insane honoring of a white guy's inability to correct his own mistake. Like, how has America spent hundreds of years honoring a white dude's idiocy? This is insane. So I will never call it by that name, but if you look it up on a map, that is what it's called. It shouldn't be called that, but okay, let's move on. So they're pushing into this reserve, this Native American reserve, and they're not really learning from the environment. However, Rebecca is firsthand creating sustainability by doing some farming, by utilizing the skills that she's picked up along the way. And unfortunately, because they are ignoring the fact that these are lands that they shouldn't have been in, her daughters get kidnapped, her sons get killed. There is just a huge amount of conflict. And I'm like, why not just go to the bit that you're allowed to be in? I don't understand. And maybe there was a reason that they didn't want to stay in the place that they were actually allowed to stay in and that had been agreed through the treaties and proclamation that they were allowed to stay in. But to me, of all the accounts of Daniel's narrative, they basically just were pushing forth through defiance and greed, like very self-centered ways of moving. And it doesn't seem like she was particularly driven in the frontier mode of like, we have to have more land and all of this, but it's more that she seemed to be just trying to sustain, like look after her family. So they just needed the land because they had a hell of a lot of kids. And I can see her perspective. I can see when you're a mom, like you will do anything to look after your kids, but ultimately, maybe just go to the bit that isn't going to come with a load of conflict. Maybe that's a good way of looking after your kids, of stopping them being kidnapped and killed. If you just stop breaking into frontiers that you shouldn't be in. I don't know. But she did create a lot of skills for herself by becoming not only like the nurse of the camp that she was in, but also like the head farmer, and she was also becoming the tanner, and she was the sharp shot, and she was like the defensive front. But she also became the midwife to her older girls, because when they had kids, she had to be the one pulling the babies out of her vagina. So yeah, I think it's really profound to see now that in where we are in history, we are creating more interest and having a resurgence of these women of history and bringing them into the light again to show that they were very matriarchal, very empowered. We're not just settling for the narrative of like, oh, she was just the wife. No, she was like an amazing human being, creating multiple settlements, not just one, but she was creating settlement after settlement after settlement because they had to move because of conflicts, because her husband kept going, making conflicts. But, you know, she was a really profound, incredibly multi-skilled woman. But what I want to add here is that just bringing her back from history so that we can see that she was empowered doesn't actually see her as a whole human being. So all of the narratives that I've read about her make her seem like an incredibly nice, kind, polite, wonderful woman. She was very beautiful. She was really tall. She had very pale skin. She had coal black hair. She was very buxom. Was she big-breasted, or had she just breastfed 10 kids? Because in a corset, that might look like buxom. I don't know. Maybe that is buxom, but may have been what happened there, but that's okay. Like, she was beautiful, wonderful, tall, sexy lady. We love it. But she also seemed pretty racist. And I don't just mean from the perspective of like, oh, ignore the Native Americans, like capacity to own their own lands, but I also mean because when her children got older and she needed to have more labor in the homestead, because they're off having their own kids, and so the labor and power resources have been diversified into other households, she got 7 slaves. And although I don't think that she was a violent person, I see the violation of another person's freedom and the possession of another person as an act of violation. And so I don't think you can be a slave owner and be considered a respectful person. I think those two things are counterposed. So I'm not really interested in hearing about how nice and polite she was if she was also trapping and possessing people. Maybe the slaves didn't think it was so bad. I don't think that having your freedom taken away can be considered anything other than completely terrible, but I'm just going to put it out there that she was a slave owner, because this gets dropped from history all the time. It's just, she was the wife of Daniel Boone. She was an amazing woman. It's she was also a invader of places that she shouldn't have been in, and a slave owner. So let's get the nuanced perspective of who she was, because I think it's really important to understand that the words frontier person or colonist doesn't really describe the person. So you might have been part of a colony, for example, her kids. A baby is technically a colonist because they are colonizing lands, but they don't have any political opinion about it. And from her behaviors of pushing into frontiers and then protecting settlements that she really had no business to have inhabited in the first place, and defying the Native Americans' respect for a hunting property and then owning slaves, tells me that there's something about her that has quite an unhealthy disrespect and disregard for others that she sees as foreign. And so I think it's important that we have a nuanced perspective of her, because I don't want to fall into the trap of just being women are amazing. It's well, yes, we have more skills that were underrepresented in history, but also there were bad things about us that should be represented too. What we want is an accurate picture of the women of history, not just this regaling of women saying they were amazing in all those ways. Yeah, she was an amazing human being. She was entrepreneur, sharp shot, amazing mom, super great nurse, midwife. She was able to do so many things, but she also had some pretty toxic views and did some pretty bad things. So I don't want to get lost in the concept of people being oh yeah, let's value women. It's no, let's see women. Let's see women as complex whole beings, because she was a complex, beautiful, damaged whole being. And I also think that we should take this as a lesson that for political sustainability, you have to have a sense that when you are ruling someone, they feel heard by you. Representation is crucial to defend against rebellion. And I think that's very important. So whilst I think that the frontiering that was done in America should never have happened, the Native Americans should have just been allowed to have their land and use it for the sustainable purposes that they were using it for, I also see that the crown colonies and the way that the ruling was happening for the colonists was never going to create a circumstance where they respected the rules that were being implemented by the monarchy on them. So please don't call Native Americans Indian Americans. Please remember that women of history were complicated people with interesting, holistic stories behind them. And please, if you happen to be in Parliament or governing others, make sure that the people that you govern are actually and accurately represented in your governing. Because if they're not heard, they'll probably rebel and you'll have a real difficult time ruling a rebellion. So yeah, those are my 3 little lessons today. But anyway, yeah, have a great day.